Again, welcome everybody for joining this evening. Very much appreciate it. My name is Kai Hushka. I'm a board member of the Oregon Community Rights Network. I'm also a longtime organizer with an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And through the years, I've had a lot of interactions on various levels to the kind of two main issues that we'll be covering tonight. So I'm really excited to be here and to speak to it. There are, of course, a number of you that are also very intimate to what's happening nationally as well as in Oregon related to the two things that we're going to cover. For those that aren't familiar with the Oregon Community Rights Network, it is a nonprofit organization. The mission of the group is to support and empower communities to secure local self-determination and self-governance rights superior to corporate power in order to protect fundamental rights, quality of life, the natural environment, public health, and safety. And as I mentioned before we officially got going, one of the ways that we have operated is to find different outreach events of these kinds to host and put out there in the world. We've done ones in the past on corporate rights, on the topic of democracy, had an excellent panel last spring on Indigenous rights. We've been recording all those, and those are available through the Oregon Community Rights Network's YouTube channel. So if you get a chance and haven't discovered that, please check that out. Additionally, like a lot of organizations, trying to do the good work, we are always open to donations. So if you feel so inclined, please go to orcrn.org. And there are some easy means there to donate if you, again, are able to. I'm going to have Terry introduce himself in a second here. He's my co-conspirator here this evening to tackle the topic. As you may have noticed in being here this evening, we dubbed tonight's event Playing Demolition Derby with Our Democratic Rights. And I want to just kind of remind us about what we mean by that. We're at a point in this year where when it comes to kind of the big electoral cycles, we're technically, I guess, in what you would call an off year. We don't have major congressional races. The next presidential race is 2024. We got some major, governor races happening next year. But despite all that, as you maybe have been witnessing, there's a lot of work going on to make our participation in our so-called government more difficult. And one way that's been happening is through voter suppression laws. So some of the big ones recently came out of Kansas, out of Texas. You've probably tracked others over the years, and my guess there'll be more coming as well. Those get a lot of attention, lots of articles, lots of talk shows, columns, speaking to how devastating it is to our democracy when we make it so difficult for people to vote. I'm going to stop here for a second. As a reminder, can people make sure that they are muted? That way we won't have interference to the recording. Thank you. So what I was saying is, the voter suppression aspect of democratic rights gets a tremendous amount of attention, as it duly should. But there are a couple other realities of what we bring into the banner of democratic rights that really don't get a whole lot of attention. And in some ways, what's happening in these other two arenas potentially is even much worse than just what's happening around the voter suppression end of it. And what I mean specifically is what we call ballot access denial and state sealing preemption. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. So ballot access denial really fundamentally is about denying the vote altogether. Voter suppression, of course, is about making it more difficult to vote. And in some cases, difficult enough that people don't vote. Ballot access denial is really about eliminating the vote altogether. And that has come in various ways that we'll get into tonight and what we mean by that. Another sort of end of that is, especially if you have citizen-made law that's up for a vote, as we're seeing an rapid really growth of what's called state sealing preemption. This is where state laws come into play and they nullify local laws that are meant to try to bolster, grow, amplify greater protections for us in our communities, whether it's for people or the environment. And corporate interests largely are driving in these state preemption laws to make that more difficult. And both those things really don't get a whole lot of conversation or attention anywhere near as much as they deserve. So we thought we'd dedicate this evening to doing that. And we'll get into specific examples of what's happening in Oregon to really highlight what that really means, because it's not just something that happens academically or for judges and courts to deal with. It's really about life and death in the end of it all. And so we'll get into that more. As part of the process tonight, as questions come up, we may do our best to kind of answer them as we go. Otherwise, we have a large chunk of time left at the end of the evening to take questions from you. So bear with us as we get through the various things that we want to present before we get to that point. Before we launch into kind of our first part of this evening, which is to do somewhat of a kind of a 101 about both ballot access, what we mean by that, and state ceiling preemption a little bit more, I thought I would hand it over to Terry very quickly to introduce himself. Terry.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It was a good, well laid out introduction too, Kai. I have been practicing law since a long time. Since 1979. I'm originally from a small town, southern Indiana, ended up somehow in northern Ohio, in Toledo, where I've lived continuously for nearly 50 years. I have conducted an activist-oriented practice from the very start, and including a lot of free speech cases and some early local democracy stuff, and found cell death and came to cell death as a field attorney in about 2014. And it's been a quite interesting ride because of the fact that cell death has been kind of on the ground floor of reintroducing or dusting off and attempting again, making new something old, which is the initiative right in Ohio, which is somewhat, from my discussions with Kai and a little research, somewhat similar to the manner in which local and state level initiatives are run in the state of Oregon. So anyway, that's me. One other thing, I have several dogs. If this we're in the Zoom era because of the pandemic, and sometimes in the daytime when I'm on conferences with corporate lawyers, somebody will bark here or get into a fight over their food bowl or something, and I simply point out that that's one of my junior associates and they're real pit bulls. Okay. So if you hear barks, if you hear growls, or if you hear Josie scratching the floor, trying to make a bed out of it, this is a sort of a study, and it's not a very comfortable place for a dog. And they sort of move around a lot and sleep, and then get up after a few minutes and move around and scratch the floor, the rug, and sleep some more.
Terry, thanks a lot for joining tonight. I know being a few hours ahead there, appreciate you staying up a little bit later to be part of this event. I think with that, Terry, if you wouldn't mind going first, the kind of first portion of tonight is really just to kind of give what I would call again a 101 about both ballot access, what we mean by that, and then also around state ceiling preemption. And then through the night, we'll work more into specifics, along with having discussion between Terry and I about sort of the ramifications of all of this. And like I said, we have a large amount of time at the end of this evening to hear from each of you and either your ideas or your questions that you may have. So Terry, I'm going to hand it back to you, and then I'll jump in after you're done around describing preemption.
Okay. First, we're going to talk about initiatives, correct? I mean, what they are. Okay. Just to talk at a very basic level, the right of initiative is present in approximately, I don't know, about 30 or 32 of the 50 states in some form or other. Ohio and, as I say, Oregon seem to share a similar structure to theirs. That is that a local government entity, people can formulate a committee that becomes the driving or organizing entity behind an initiative. An initiative, of course, is a way of drafting your own law and proposing it go to the ballot and actually waging a campaign, an issue campaign as to whether or not voters should vote for it and thus make it into law. It's kind of a simple concept. It dates back roughly a little over 100 years in most states to what was called the Progressive Era, just a little bit before World War I, where ending the Victorian era, where legislatures were very, very predominant in most states as the governing force, where governors were relatively weak, and in a few states even simply appointed by some type of indirect system. But in any event, the initiative right in Ohio came into being in 1912 after a constitutional convention. And this is kind of typically what occurred in that era. It was highly controversial because it was viewed as a serious populist reaction and reform to large utility and railroad corporations that were dominating state politics, particularly in Ohio, the General Assembly, the legislature. That there's a roughly similar story in a number of states, particularly in the Midwest and the Western regions too. Anyway, the idea locally in Ohio is that, for instance, municipalities, municipal governments, towns and cities have the right to circulate initiative petitions, usually requiring a percentage. In Ohio, it's 10% of the people who voted for governor in the last election. You have to have that many signatures, and that means that you actually have to collect more than that. It's a lot of pavement pounding, solicitation, and at a certain point before an election, the petitions are presented to the local, that is county level board of elections, which is supposed to simply objectively and dispassionately count them and make sure that the forms were completed correctly and notarized, signature gatherer signatures, that sort of mechanical stuff. That's sort of like the nice civics textbook part of it. It's turned into, especially in the past 15 to 20 years in many states, such as where I live, it's turned into a much more politicized and in fact, oftentimes ugly and viciously anti-democratic type of process, where the Board of Elections, which is actually lawfully simply acting ministerially and is supposed to, as I say, do the mechanics of making sure there are enough signatures that meet the threshold and all that, where boards of election are now openly encouraged by some outlaw state statutes and some very poorly reasoned court decisions to actually dive into and veto, if they wish, the contents of a proposal. So what we've moved to in Ohio is effectively a system of censorship, where only legal controversies, legal proposals that are acceptable to the existing status quo ruling elements locally or at the Secretary of State level are the ones who get to determine what can go to the ballot. There are nice platitudes in the 105 or 6 years it's been since the initiative was created in Ohio. There's 24 Ohio Supreme Court cases spanning that century of time, all of which consistently say you can count the signatures, you can make sure the forms are filled out correctly, but you cannot inquire into the content before putting something on the ballot. But the very conservative strictures of Ohio's courts have combined to really weaken that very bright line concept so that it is not consistently followed. I think that there are analogous situations going on where you folks are, and I'm expecting Kai to talk about that. Okay.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, we can definitely dig into more about Oregon and other places as well. I think before I jump in on just an overview of preemption, are there any basic questions just around what Terry laid out in the sense of what we mean with ballot access or ballot access denial in tonight's topic, and how that's connected to the initiative process? Anything that it wasn't maybe clear, or you had something else in your head that you would like to ask at this point?
Yeah, I have a question, Kai
Sure.
and Terry. When did all this get started with preemption? I mean, things like this don't usually happen overnight. It's usually kind of a slow process. Is there any value in knowing how this all started?
I'll defer somewhat to Kai, but I can tell you that from my experience, it's looking a lot like the 1920s and 30s is where you begin to see preemption happening. And I hate to be so darkly cynical, but a great deal of it comes down to the fact that a lot of political control is exerted. The most economic place to put your money if you're going to buy politicians is at the state legislative level, and basically cut off or curtail local political initiatives, even if they aren't actual legal initiatives, if they are efforts made by local officials to promote local governance and local standards. So we're talking basically roughly a century. The concept of preemption is somewhat older than that, but of course didn't really come into vogue until people started acting out of line, and the political powers that be felt a need to curtail that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, think about it historically speaking, you had in the late 1800s, probably with the largest democratic movement in the populists at the time, who were very much about democratizing our system of government. They came at it from an economic standpoint, but it was much bigger than that. They unfortunately were only able to take things so far. You then really had what were called the progressives, who brought in the initiative, referendum, recall process that you see now in various states. Again, as a means to make government more about the people. It's also as a means to challenge corporate power. So it's kind of a natural backlash to people wanting to have more say about where they live, that those who controlled the system would again invoke or exercise the ability to control that system. And I think that's why you've seen the evolution of preemption become what it is. It's also why you see ballot access denial cases on the increase, because as people again have tried to speak out to the betterment of their communities, the system has actually punished them for doing so.
Yeah. Yes, if I could tack one footnote to that, a good example of something that is tied in conceptually to this entire concept of initiative is that one of the ways the progressive era, the if you will, the more left radical kinds of efforts were thwarted was by the creation in the early 1900s of state public service and public utility commissions. Railroads were economically dictating where towns would be formed, and basically the spread of what we I guess call civilization, but also fledgling electric distribution companies, which were originally formed as simply local government run generating facilities for trolleys and street lighting, were beginning to branch into more household grade uses of electricity. It was becoming, there were big fights that took place circa 1900 about whether utilities would be publicly owned or privately owned. Particularly in my part of the country, investor-owned utilities are very, very predominant. I know it's rather different in many parts of the West, but that was a huge historic battle. And the solution in Ohio and many other states was they create this politically insulated Public Utilities Commission that locks in monopoly territory for railroads and utilities and telephone companies and that sort of thing. And it's they're gubernatorially appointed commissioners on specific fixed terms, but that is the beginning also of the regulatory model. And the regulatory model 100 years later, we're seeing is, for the most part, almost in every instance, is an abysmal failure. And now people are rediscovering, passing or trying to pass their own laws to take the power back into their own hands.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. So the other side was to give a bit of an overview, again, in an introductory form about what we mean by preemption. I've got just a couple slideshow that I used for a recent workshop I did on preemption itself. That one was called Preemption as a Lethal Weapon, How Corporations and Government Are Deliberately Destroying Communities. And with that, wanted to just give you a sense of what we mean when we say preemption. So what we mean is basically, as it sounds, is when you have one jurisdiction overriding that of another. And so, in very simple but also very real way, you have the federal level overriding the state and the state overriding the local. In a lot of cases, in fact, in the predominant cases, that's the general flow of how power wields itself. And that means that whatever is said at the higher level up will preempt whatever actions are attempted to be taken at that lower level. So that's what we mean by preemption. Just simply speaking, there are things like expressed preemption. This is where things are really spelled out more clearly. I think as an example for Oregon, for instance, a more recent example is things like the ban on GMO bans themselves. So the power of agricultural seed is going to be controlled by the state, and they were very clear that local jurisdictions should have no authority over anything to do with agricultural seed. So they're very expressed in that. There was also a more recent rent control law passed in Oregon that was very clear in saying that rent control levels would be set by the state, and local jurisdictions would have no authority to have more stringent rent control than whatever the state sets. Another arena is what's called implied. This is where you have basically someone acting in a manner already to a large extent, and so the courts see that really is that they are the authority in this particular field. So it's already implied that they will preempt you. Again, the federal level and state, in most cases, over that of the local. But you, of course, have conflicts between federal and state when it comes to implied as well. And as a subset of that implied world, you have something called field preemption. This is where it's even sort of more clear that you have someone in the realm of preempting others. The example I give here is nuclear energy. So you have this implied field preemption that the federal government really is the buck stops with them, basically, when it comes to anything having to do with that particular world. What we often talk about in the community rights world when we talk about preemption is we talk about state ceiling preemption, meaning that the state keeps putting things in place that create a ceiling of which the local level governments can't go above. And that ceiling, unfortunately, in a lot of cases is not sufficient enough in relation to community needs, public health, the environment. And so there's always these moves by the local level governments to try to better the community, yet you have these state ceiling preemption laws in place that deny that capability of the local level government from doing so. And that has been very much on the increase in the last 20 years. It's been pushed by organizations like ALEC. So the cabal of different, corporate entities who have their hands in all kinds of things, have been driving these new laws into place at the state level. As Terry mentioned earlier, they've kind of figured out that if you can control the state level governments, you then control the local level. And in some ways, it becomes easier than trying to, put all your eggs in the federal basket. So you've seen a large increase, and we'll get into some examples later about how that's been on the sort of upswing in the last few years, for sure. I have a short video. I'm going to start it here, and hopefully you can hear the audio. I'll stop it after I start it.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Pomerance. I'm a public health lawyer and assistant.
Are you able to hear the audio? I can't see anybody at the moment, so if someone can just say yes or no.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to start it again. I'm going to just play a couple minutes. This is from a woman named Jennifer Pomerance. She's an NYU professor, does a lot of work in the arena of public health. And as part of that, really looking at how state ceiling preemption has been a detriment to public health. But this couple minutes slide is really just about, again, laying out what preemption really is, and she does a very good job here in this short couple minutes. So this is why I chose to play this. So here we go. Oops.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Pomerance. I'm a public health lawyer and assistant professor at the School of Global Public Health at NYU. I'll be giving a quick overview of state preemption of local policymaking, a topic that I research a great deal. So preemption, and what we're talking about here today is sometimes called ceiling preemption, is when the state removes the authority for local governments to act. Another term that should not be confused with preemption is floor preemption, are actually minimum standards. These are not preemption, and this is when the state provides baseline standards that allow local governments to engage in policymaking to improve upon or add to these standards. The Civil Rights Act, the Federal Civil Rights Act, is one of these and allows states to provide additional protections not afforded by federal law. And another term just on this topic is called a savings clause, and this is when a state expressly reserves local authority to engage in policy making on the specific topic. And sometimes this is paired with minimum standards, and sometimes it's just an express grant of authority to local governments to engage in policy making on that topic. So what we're seeing is a great deal of preemption across the country. This is a concern for public health lawyers and public health practitioners and stakeholders because often local officials are closest to their community members. They know their constituents, they know what their needs and values are. And the constituents have voted in these local officials for the reason to have them engage in representative democracy and engage in policymaking that's responsive to the needs and values of their community. There's a real concern that when local governments are not able to engage in policymaking, they can't address local issues, and the state governments often cannot or do not address specific issues that are of concern to local communities. And also, local governments are historically innovative, and they sometimes come up with great policy solutions that can't be just tried out at a state or federal level.
So that's just kind of recap some of the things I brought up. And that video is also on the ORCRN YouTube channel if you want to watch the rest of it. I think it's about 8 minutes. What we wanted to do now is kind of get into some general examples, and then we'll talk specifically about things that are currently in play in Oregon related both to ballot access and state ceiling preemption. So I want to hand it back to you, Terry, to talk about sort of what you're seeing, or maybe some examples of what you're experiencing or things that you've witnessed, either directly in your work or, otherwise around sort of the increase of ballot access denial, really the incursion of the judicial branch into the political branch. We haven't, framed it that way, but that's basically what's happening here. There's a political consideration, delivered by the people. And you're seeing the courts increasingly creep into the political process prior to something becoming actual law. And that's come in many different forms. A number of you who are on this call, understand that firsthand in your own work, what that means in the sense of ballot access denial. But Terry, if you just want to give a little bit of context there and some specifics, I'll follow up with you just on what's happening in the state ceiling preemption world on that same note.
Okay, I hope this is sort of appropriate in that direction. Understand that ceiling preemption wouldn't be a problem if we could rely on state level, state legislatures to pass laws that were well considered and expansive and responsive, in fact, to the suggestions from the public. But in fact, what you end up with now is mediocrity basically aimed at preserving status quo, and typically that means corporate control and or governmental control over any innovation. So ceiling preemption actually is sort of branched off into some specialty areas, one of which is vacuum preemption, which is where the state legislature in Ohio has forbidden any local minimum wage or livable wage laws to be initiated by local, boy, and blue is barking, sorry, by governmental entities at the local level. But the state has not changed the minimum wage in Ohio for, I think, 37 years. So in effect, there's a vacuum. There's the federal minimum wage law, and good luck with that. That's vacuum preemption. Another is punitive, where in states like Arizona and Florida most recently, we're seeing legislature passing anti-masking or anti-various provisions related to resisting or fighting back against public health measures related to COVID. And there are actual monetary penalties, such as for school districts who pass masking requirements through their school boards. So that's punitive preemption. Then there's nullification, which is I've seen here, but the most notable examples are several years ago when Charlotte, North Carolina passed an LGBTQ-friendly ordinance. The state legislature went completely nuts and passed a law basically making it illegal for local government to extend civil rights in that way. In Texas, in Denton, Texas, there was an attempt to have a local fracking ban put on the ballot. It made its way onto the ballot, and lightning seconds, actually a few days or a week before the actual election took place, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the legislature made it illegal for any local government to hold an initiative vote on a fracking ban. In Ohio, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was passed by the citizens of Toledo, and there was immediately, literally 12 hours after it was enacted, there was a lawsuit. But that's not the real killer. Was about 2 months afterwards, when the state legislature, the Ohio General Assembly, passed a law making it illegal for any rights of nature provision to appear on any ballot anywhere within the state of Ohio. Again, that's simply nullification. And it maybe in that case overlaps with vacuum preemption. So the problem is that there is a lot of very highly politicized weaponization of the ceiling preemption concept. In Ohio, and this differs somewhat, but not a great deal from Oregon, as I indicated earlier, there's a long line, 25 or so decisions of the Ohio Supreme Court that forbid elections officials from prying into the content of an initiative. However, about 4 or 5 years ago, the legislature passed a statute saying that elections boards can consider whether a measure falls within the realm of what a local government can do. And it's a little bit more legalistically worded, but it is an absolute open season, void, sort of empty concept, because if you are especially if you're not a municipal law specialist or a lawyer who specializes in it, you may, as an election official, have an opinion about what should or shouldn't be within the power of local governments to enact. But in Ohio, whatever your feeling is, whatever your uneducated impression is as to what Ohio law says, you get to vote on that. And it's extremely troubling. We've litigated it repeatedly, and the Ohio Supreme Court, even though dissenting opinions have repeatedly pointed out that this law contains no standards, and it actually makes all 88 of Ohio's county election boards into constitutional courts, making constitutional decisions as to what's allowable to be put on the ballot and what can't be put on the ballot, even though the Ohio Supreme Court knows that from some very articulate dissenting opinions and from reality. They still keep finding little whack-a-mole kinds of exceptions as to why a measure can't go on the ballot, even without finding fault on the part of the local election board. They proceed to find some other claimed error and denying access to the ballot for that reason. And that's sort of in partial answer to Rob Dickinson's question about the attempts to narrow the scope of possible ballot measures. That is definitely happening. I am sure that, and have had the feeling recurringly in recent years that the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is actually using a lot of states as experimental grounds to see how to best kill off initiative.
It's interesting though, like in Oregon, it's some of those rules have really come about not from corporate interest, but actually from liberal progressive minded organizations. The belief is that the political wins are in their favor. Oregon being controlled by the Democrats, typically the governor's office, as well as the House and the Senate. And so the analysis is that the initiative process could be an entry point for the bad guys, has been the belief. And with that, they've created these mechanisms of really what becomes substantive reviews of policy in advance of something becoming policy. Which is really a double standard when you start to look at it. In Oregon, it's a constitutional right to bring laws forward as the people. Yet the standard of which you have to move yourself through, and we'll get into the example shortly here about Lane County, even the invention of new means of supposedly adhering to rules of what an initiative can consist of before something even gets voted on, really is not what happens in the legislature itself. For instance, you don't see people walking in telling policymakers they can't consider something. What happens is they just do it. And then if there's legal or constitutional problems, someone brings that up afterwards. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. But with citizen lawmaking, apparently it's a double standard. And so you have these variations in different places about who the culprit is for making the initiative process harder. In Washington state, as an example around ballot initiatives, what we'd started to see, especially through the community rights world, was corporations stepping in to challenge the idea of initiatives getting on the ballot, to Terry's point, that making the argument that if this law is adopted, it's going to exceed the local authority's ability to implement the law. Therefore, it shouldn't be voted on at all. So it was sort of proffered as doing the voters a favor, that we see this as problematic, it's not going to stand, so therefore, why should you be subjected to something that isn't going to be upheld? So here again is what I mentioned earlier. You have people infusing the legal process into the political. And unfortunately, like we've seen also in history, once the argument's made enough and often enough, the judges start to believe it. And then they start to enact law that actually erodes the capability of direct democracy, which of course came about, as we spoke earlier, because government and power brokers weren't actually doing the business of the people. And so that's what's happened in Washington state. They've differentiated local initiatives to state initiatives and made it, to Terry's phrasing, anything that's beyond the status quo isn't going to see the light of day, most likely. So technically the initiative process is there, but color outside the lines and you're most likely to get punished for it. So those are two examples of what's happening, and we'll get into the other example around Oregon here shortly. And just also to mention, just in the sense of a laundry list of issues where state ceiling preemption has come into play, I mean, it runs the gamut. Beyond just what Terry mentioned, it touches everything from school curriculums, to wages, to paid sick leave, to housing development, to factory farms, to GMOs, to gun control, to pesticide use, to mask mandates, climate change, plastic bags, fossil fuel infrastructure, protesting, rent control. And I'm pretty sure that's not even an exhaustive list. So you can see that certain interests are making sure that their MO, their directives, their objectives are being met despite what people want to see happen, as Jennifer Pomerance had mentioned. And as we see when we look into the realm of movements themselves, that real innovation has come from the local, yet our ability to put things forward for others to see is being cut off, whether it's ballot access or whether it's state ceiling preemption. the combination of that is pretty horrific when you start to really see about, how do we even have a functioning democracy if we even had one at all, if we don't have the means of bringing ideas forward to transform government itself. So it is a big deal. It is something happening in Oregon itself. So I want to kind of highlight two things happening, and then Terry and I are going to have a little back and forth before we hand it off to you guys to sort of ask questions or make comments about what you're hearing. But the specific examples in Oregon that relate to these issues, one comes out of Lane County. So through the really amazing efforts that have been going on now, I was trying to calculate in my head, 10 years almost, if not almost longer, the people there have been really trying to bring voice to the community, bring voice to nature itself. And they've tried to do so through the initiative process. And they have two initiatives that went through the process as Terry described, gathered the signatures, they had the valid numbers, it should have just gone to the vote of the people. Instead, oppositional forces decided to create really a new argument that the initiatives didn't qualify under something called the separate vote. This is where it also gets to kind of legalese between, single subject versus separate vote. But the basic notion is that there are too many parts in this thing, right, and these things need to be voted on separately. And that initiatives can't exceed the separate vote requirement, though it's never been applied before at Initiative Oregon. Suddenly now it's going to apply these two initiatives coming out of Lane County, one having to do with stopping aerial spray of pesticide. The other, more interestingly, is about the ability of people to practice democracy in their own communities. So the right of self-government being challenged by the corporate interest that clearly have demonstrated that they want to be the decision makers over that of the people. So both these measures were denied ballot access. In a lot of ways, there was complicity of the local government itself participating in it. So you have, again, government and corporate interests coming together. This is a real life example of that. The people in Lane County there, the community rights group, challenged the notion that they didn't meet the requirements. That has made its way through the courts to the point where they're trying to knock on the door of the Supreme Court. So they went through the lower court to the appellate court. And unfortunately, to date, the courts have not recognized that they're interfering with the political process, that they should be backing away, that this is not their time to speak. They'll have time later to question the legality or the constitutionality. But to Terry's point, if they were really doing their job correctly, they would be silent and they would eliminate the barriers for potential innovation and policy to be considered and wait till their time to come in once it's adopted as law. So the group is currently at the mode of asking, or what's called petitioning, the Supreme Court to take the case. The argument being that this is a very significant case. It really needs to be settled. And ideally, it needs to be settled in favor of really citizen power, because if the Oregon Constitution is going to say people have the right to make law, why are we making it to the point where it's not just difficult, but potentially impossible to make law if we're recognized to have that particular authority? And so that's what's happening in that particular case to date, is to see about the Supreme Court taking up the case. There's an active effort to get what's called Friends of the Court briefs, amicus briefs, so to get individuals and groups who are also interested in this idea of democratic rights and initiatives and ballot access to also chime in to say, hey, this is critical, and you need to take this case, and actually you need to make a decision in favor really of the ability of citizens to bring up new policy. Otherwise, you're really undermining democracy itself, freedom of speech, so on and so forth. So a lot of effort going into making that a reality there in Lane County, which also has effects beyond just Lane County. Remember, this will have ramifications across the state, depending on what kind of decision comes down. Their neighbors on the coast, Lincoln County, has a case really dealing with the state ceiling preemption part of our presentation tonight. In their case, through some amazing organizing effort, both by people in Lincoln County and those supporting Lincoln County, we're able to get a ban on aerial spray adopted in 2018, if I've got the date correct now. which was no easy feat. If you look at the official disclosing of political dollars that went into the campaign by the opposition, I think the dollar total ended up somewhere in the $500,000 to $600,000 range. It was discovered later through some investigative journalism that corporate interests actually probably spent close to $2 million to dissuade people in a propaganda campaign. And okay, someone corrected me, 2017. That's how long, unfortunately, these things last, especially when the courts get involved. So a lot of money was spent to basically dissuade people from voting in their best interest. Another interesting thing that came out more recently is the timber industry itself did their own polling, as you can imagine, their own surveying, what sort of leading questions people would get. But by their own survey, they also realized that people don't want aerial spray of pesticides. So it wasn't just the people who understand the impacts of it who are trying to stop it, but the industry who's been legally allowed to do it has also got the notification that people don't want it. Yet despite that, like in Toledo, the lawsuit came down almost immediately once the law was passed. It too has gone through the courts. Interestingly enough, it took over 2 years before the local or the lower court ruled on behalf of the timber interests in favor basically of the power of preemption. So for 2 years, there was no aerial spraying that we know of in Lincoln County, as also a demonstration that it wasn't going to economically collapse the timber industry if they couldn't do it, which is one of the arguments they tried to make. Like Lane County, the case also went to the appellate level and now is also on the doorsteps of the Oregon Supreme Court in hopes that the court takes their case to really get at this doctrine saying it's gotten out of hand. You know, how is government supposed to be legitimate if government can actually implement protections for the people or the environment, even if it's the lower level government trying to do so? So this is where when Jennifer Pomerance talked about the floor. So if the floor is set, then the ability of another level of government, in this case, the lower level, to raise that floor of protections, it should be allowed. In fact, it should be constitutionally protected. And that this idea that that is being squelched by things like the Farm and Forest Act around pesticide use is really antithetical to the purpose of government, antithetical to the Constitution itself. And so it's a very important case, not only again for Lincoln County, but I think a pretty critical case, not only for Oregon, but really nationwide, if the courts can see that this doctrine has really been abused and misused, and that the idea of people moving greater protections, even if it comes at that local level government, should be allowed to do so. It's pretty exciting to see what will happen, and ideally Lincoln County will prevail. They also are in the midst of preparing and lining up amicus briefs, waiting to see if the court will take the case. And just to say that when you petition the Supreme Court at the state level, at least, you know, the courts can choose to take the case or not take the case. So there's no guarantee. There was a guarantee to be at the appellate level. There's no guarantee to make it in front of the Supreme Court in this case. So we will see what happens, keep you updated. The group in Lane County is Community Rights Lane County. You can Google them, find out what they're up to, lend your support, whether it's volunteering or donating. The group in Lincoln County is Lincoln County Community Rights. Somebody can drop that in chat if they haven't done it already. Also a very worthy group to support in their efforts. And both have been at it a very long time, all volunteers. And really their efforts have done what the initiative process was meant to do, which is to really give power to the people. And they haven't been shy about exercising that. So kudos to everyone who is part of those groups that are here tonight. And I recognize a number of the names. So with that, we want to kind of just slide into a little bit of a back and forth between Terry and I, moving away just from the legal explanations of what ballot access is and the cases around it and state ceiling preemption, and just kind of off the cuff, Terry, just, you know, talk about what you're seeing in the sense of what does this really mean to communities when, you know, government isn't really, in my mind, or in my words, you know, showing itself as being illegitimate through exercises like ballot access denial and state ceiling preemption. I mean, what have you seen? Where is this leading? I mean, what's your sense of stuff about where this can go, and ideally, you know, what can stem the tide of the use of these kinds of measures that really not only affect democratic rights, but again, affect the idea of democracy itself and the purpose of government.
How long do you have?
We have about 5 minutes, so.
What I'm seeing is a very disturbing picture where the waves of repression of this, incidentally, folks, this is a First Amendment free exercise kind of, it's a freedom of association. You speak politically through your balloting. And there are some federal implications which are also very unfortunately being destroyed. But what I'm seeing is that the bastards don't quit. In Columbus, a group we were affiliated with circulated a petition. It ultimately got gunned down under the vague statute I was talking about a while ago. But the reaction of the city council of Columbus, capital of Ohio, right? 1 million people. The reaction of the city council was they reduced the allowable time in which you can circulate petitions. I want to point out one of the things that we didn't emphasize, but when you basically the system Kai was describing, where you have the pre-ballot censorship veto kind of thing, and it's actually happening here in Ohio. It's just sort of by another name. But what you really are talking about is it's a political argument, as Kai mentioned, over a theoretical, something that's a proposal, for God's sake. It's not been passed into law. It still has to be voted upon by, you have to win. And then once it is a real thing, once it is a genuine law, you have a ripe controversy to take to a court and let a judge or a panel of judges make some decision as to what is lawful. But more than that, there is a legal doctrine called severability. And the judges are obliged to attempt to save legislation, not to simply decapitate it and crumple it up and throw it away. And this pre-ballot veto by election officials is an all or nothing prospect. The terribly worded statute in Ohio basically is an all or nothing thing. If the Board of Elections feels like this conflicts with their impression of what a local government can do, the entire measure is dead. And I can give you a number of examples, but a good example is where in recent years, there's still a movement to legalize recreational marijuana in the state. And there have been local attempts to pass referenda that essentially decriminalize it by effectively creating locally, by reducing felony grade stuff down to misdemeanors. And that particular attempt is not typically lawful, and that can get struck down, but it is possible under Ohio law to reduce higher order misdemeanors to lower order misdemeanors. So if you pass by initiative a bundle of things, some of which are lawful and some of which aren't, the whole thing goes out the window if the election board gets to pitch it early on. Some of it will stay on the books, and decriminalization could occur if you get to, after the election, have a court reviewing it. And I don't mean any aspersions to anyone who hasn't been to law school and that sort of thing. And judges can be corrupt and awful and ridiculous and absurd in their rulings also. But I have a lot more confidence in somebody who at least is in the business of making legal decisions than a board of elections where people aren't. One other thing I'd like to tell you, and this has been field tested in Ohio and it may be coming your way, is a particularly odious thing that happened about 3 or 4 years ago. At the state level, they created a new method, a 2-step method of passing a state level initiative. And the way it was done was on the back of a marijuana legalization move. a group had a group had initiated for the ballot at the state level legalization of marijuana, creating 10 monopolies, that there would be licensing of 10 entities to grow and produce and market. And some clever corporate lawyers came up with the idea of at the same statewide election, putting on the ballot a measure to completely change how initiatives are passed at the state level. And it passed because they also roiled the waters about, oh, monopoly, and oh my God, and our weed is going to be controlled and prices will be artificially spiked, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it got voted down, and along with it, this supposed reform measure that was sponsored by a lot of corporate interests that had no interest, didn't care at all about legalizing marijuana, had funded the campaign. What it does, the law in Ohio now, thanks to the potheads who couldn't read and couldn't understand what the hell was going on, and I'm a pothead too, but not that ardent. But what now happens in Ohio is, if there's a state level initiative, 2 screens mandatorily come up. The first one says, do you want to change Ohio's marijuana law so that recreational marijuana is legal? Yes or no? If you vote yes, I do want to change it, then the second screen is where you actually get to vote on the proposal. So the wording of the first screen is a subject of considerable debate and acrimony, because you basically get to, depending on who wins that argument, which is refereed by the Secretary of State, who invariably in the last 2 or 3 decades has been a right-winger, the wording on the ballot of the first measure, it's basically, do you want to legalize murder now? And if your answer is yes, then you get to vote on it. If your answer is more predictably no, then it kills the measure at the first stage. So look for that coming your way if other things fail.
I was going to throw out a couple of things, and then we'll turn it over to the group here. On that note, Terry, it's interesting on just the ways of which, if it's not about denying access, it's about skewing the vote. And what happened in Spokane, Washington, the local city council, who was oppositional to the people's effort, voted to place what they'd call advisory questions on the ballot that had to do specifically with the initiative that was being voted on. They also voted to order the ballot such that these advisory questions preceded the vote of the measure itself. And the questions had to do with, do you want to raise taxes and do you want to cut services if you vote in the measure itself? So it was all this assumption that somehow taxes were going to go up and services were going to be cut if you vote for this thing. So it's a similar kind of thing you just described, but in some ways in a more nefarious way of actually trying to affect the vote on the ballot itself. So it wasn't just about a fair campaign in the sense of people, saying whatever their propaganda is. It's about campaigning that actually crawled onto the ballot itself. So it was a very interesting thing that came out of Spokane. The one thing I wanted to say, just in general sense, just in the ramification, is when these things happen, when the ballot access starts to grow and stunt or even completely deny the ability for citizen lawmaking, or when state sealing preemption, as it's been expanding, happens, one realm, it very much chills the populace, which is its whole intent. It's to get people to not speak up. It's to get people to shut up. It's get people to be, back in their spot, don't rock the boat. I mean, that is a real effect of what happens when these things take place. On the flip side, as those who've been doing this work, the understanding is these just become more and more clear pieces of evidence that government is illegitimate, that government isn't really about us, that government, the way that it's structured, really isn't a democracy or representative of what the people, the environment needs. which should further the call for transforming how government works and what it looks like. So when these things happen, yeah, they will surely chill out the ability to organize. They will definitely suck your time up, as both Lane and Lincoln can attest to, because when things enter the court, it's a bit of a black hole in a way. But at the same time, these are all things that can be used to sort of show that the system really is fixed a certain direction. And really it's fixed in the direction of the wealthy elite, the powerful, the commercial interest. And it really isn't functioning in a way to what we really need. So isn't that more energy for us to say, well, we want something different, let's mobilize for it. So it all depends on how you look at it, which I think is a large degree of what this community rights work has been about, is about reorienting ourselves to when these things happen, whether again, it's the ballot access denial aspect or state ceiling preemption coming down. I want to hand it off to Nancy Ward. She's the coordinator for the Oregon Community Rights Network, also a board member. She's on the call tonight, and she has agreed to kind of field questions either in chat, or if you want to raise your hand or drop your name in Stack, please do so. And Terry and I will do our best to answer your questions, or if you have a short comment you want to make in relation to what we've been talking about, I think that would be fine as well. So it's, I'm, I guess, in some ways handing the mic over to all of you at this point. Don't speak all at once, though, please.
I just dropped all that information in chat, and while we're waiting for people to either raise their hand or put themselves in Stack or type their question, I just would like both of you to address how do we keep our enthusiasm up for this work? I mean, what you're painting is a pretty grim picture about this idea that even doing things in the correct way, following all the rules, the barriers just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Why should we still keep playing this game?
I don't know if this will answer it, Nancy, but the first thing that popped in my head was during one of the petitioning efforts in Spokane around a community bill of rights that had to do with all kinds of things, housing access, the environment, the economy, workers' rights. It's a very broad proposal, neighborhood control over major development. And during the signature gathering phase, someone walked up and looked at what was there, and the response after reading it looked at the petitioner and said, you realize you're asking to overturn 500 plus years of English common law. And this may sound kind of obscure, but the person said, yep. And I said, okay, and they signed it. So my point being is, the ballot access, the state preemption are just elements of really a corrupt system that's been around a very, very long time. And so I say that mainly to say we need to give ourselves a little bit of credit. This is going to take a while. This system is very well entrenched. It finds new ways to screw with us. It's had control of the levers, since its inception and even beyond that or before that. And so we're just now kind of coming up to speed to understand that more clearly and to challenge it, I think, in more effective ways. So despite what seemed like defeats and being demoralized and overwhelmed, we have to realize that we're just now, I think, getting clear on what needs to be done. And I'm still of the mind that even with a little bit more activity, a little bit more action, a little bit more people joining, that could be enough of the momentum that really tips things. And so I think, to me, that's what keeps me energized, is that, we're applying pressure in the right ways. I think we're also open to new strategies and tactics, which I think is also highly important as we move forward. And I think with that, our probability is still there. I don't know where it sits on the probability meter between 0% and 100%, but I think it's still there. And I think that's, the inspiration to keep doing this, despite the increase of state ceiling preemption, or despite the invention of new ways to screw with direct lawmaking powers of people.
Michelle, who is from Lane County, just put in chat, seems the government officials who magnanimously granted the people a role in governing through the initiative system didn't think we had the will or the work ethic to actually do the work. When they saw us writing initiatives, they created obstacles upon obstacles to dissuade us, to disincentivize this democratic activity, but we're not going away anytime too damn soon. Yay, Michelle.
Yay, Michelle.
Yay, Michelle.
My response to Michelle's point and your question, Nancy, is that I think that local governance is about to be forced very heavily on us as supply chains break down, as economic and environmental collapse is being propelled and accelerated in the Anthropocene. I really think that there are going to be isolating kinds of events that happen, and people are going to be compelled, in order to survive as a collective activity, are going to be taking power back. What needs to be happening is continued resistance, an understanding that this is long haul stuff. And it certainly isn't, I'm kind of assuming that most of the people on this call are probably involved somewhat or lots in movements and are becoming cognizant, if they weren't already, with the fact that you're talking in some instances about a very long-term, if not lifelong commitment. And it's, I guess it beats the hell out of watching Monday Night Football.
Mhm.
But in all seriousness, it's the sort of thing where local governance local democracy is going to continue to make a return because of the massive and dramatic overreaches that we're seeing. I mean, you can't get spanked and scuffed and kicked around by state legislators like we are in Ohio. The same bill where they made it illegal to raise rights of nature in any court in the state of Ohio, the legislature also ruled, because we have hundreds of confined animal feeding operations with all kinds of water pollution and air pollution and really serious manure handling problems, they made common law nuisance lawsuits against runaway, non-compliant, environmental law breaking, huge confined animal feeding operations. You can't bring a common law nuisance lawsuit against them anymore. How in the hell can you do that? How can you really make something like that stand? If there's no recourse through the courts, there will be recourse in other ways that will be a lot less governable. And that's, I think, where things are moving almost inexorably.
So you bring up an interesting point, Terry. We've been talking a lot in our Oregon group about mutual aid, which has sprung up in Portland in particular. And it does seem to have a lot of appeal. I live in a rural community that has also is talking about this end of the spectrum. And the interesting thing is, it's a group of people in our community that have very different political ideals, but they have come together around this idea of mutual aid. And do you see a way that we can bring that into the community rights fold and somehow incorporate that in a practical way alongside the work that we do writing initiatives and trying to pass regulations?
Well, I don't, if your question is, should there be some sort of local democracy regulation of mutual aid, I'm not in favor of that. I think mutual aid arises because people at a human and humane level realize that they maybe have more than their neighbors and are willing to help and share, and people sort of begin to function in a reciprocating type of way. So I think that, again, there's a certain inevitability to that because of the fact that I think there is going to be some movement back in the direction of community. The communities have formed out of desperation. Communities formed out of a need for local self-protection. As much as we have a veneer, and it's only a veneer, of social control, things are seemingly venturing closer and closer to some sort of brink. And I think that watching the dizzying number of incredible wildfires and the environmental, I mean, places where, you know, the Chinook winds and the rain pattern across the Northwest is no longer holding. And in places within the Arctic Circle, in many countries, where there are dozens and dozens of wildfires and the tundra is actually collapsing and compressing. I just keep watching what is happening to the natural world and people within it. And I don't see anything but a continuing spiraling decline. And that's going to mean that supply chains and the plunder, the habitual plunder for stuff, is going to get very dear and and altered. So I think that there will be an absolute need, and in fact a growing one, for mutuality networks.
Thanks, Terry. And Krista Niddle, I think you have a question for our speakers.
Yeah, my question is if you're aware of, or if you want to say, if you could say anything about sortition or citizens' assemblies, because I see that happening in Europe, and it's happening like at the city level and also the national level. I know there was a climate citizens assembly in Oxford, England, and there have been climate citizens assemblies at the national level in France and Scotland and another country. And they're being, I think, a lot inspired by Extinction Rebellion, which is an international movement that started in the UK. And their third demand is that there needs to be a citizens' assembly on the climate because our government is incapable of making the tough choices that need to be done to solve the climate crisis. So as we're going over 1.5 degrees centigrade and, you know, not fulfilling the Paris Agreement and all that, citizens around the world are joining Extinction Rebellion and demanding citizens' assemblies as a way of having democracy. And it goes back to ancient Athens. It's been around. So anyways, that's a movement I'm involved in.
Yeah, that the Oregon Community Rights Network featured a woman named Camila Vergara last in January, February of this year, I think it was, who spoke to that very idea. In fact, she's from Chile, and so as Chile is going through their constitutional rewrite process, they're utilizing the citizen assembly model of putting issues forward, of voting, really trying to practice a more truer democracy. So I think there is, in my mind, I think that falls in the category of what Nancy brought up in sort of parallel system, mutual or alternative type systems sort of thinking, which all makes sense, to Terry's point with if the system itself doesn't provide, people find a way to do it. And I think one of the means that we have to obviously investigate is how are we going to have forms of decision-making or governance if what we have now is not working or has shown itself as being illegitimate? Will things like citizens' assemblies be the thing that emerges? I think those are all things worth investigating. I mean, ultimately it comes down to what power does that wield, in the sense of, does it really change things on the ground? And I think that's ultimately what the objective needs to be. But I think, we have to look at that. And there are a lot of fronts. I think using citizens' assemblies are the means for really implementing greater democracy, are all actually necessary. And then the question is, how does that really, one, stop the destructive tendencies of the existing system, and at the same time usher in the system that we really need for people and the planet simultaneously? We have a very tall order right now. So to Nancy's earlier question about, despair, it's a pretty big undertaking. But I think your work there and others looking at citizens assemblies, needs to be investigated more. But it's also a pretty scary prospect when you begin to think about it. I mean, right now, people still look to the system to sort of somehow change it, so they propose things through ballot initiatives, for instance. And if they're successful, they expect them to be upheld, but then things like state ceiling preemption come crashing down on them. And so you're embroiled in all that, and you try to do your best within that. And now when you start talking about, well, the system is really not worth saving, we have to develop our own system, that's a whole other level for people in a lot of ways to get to. I think it's a very real place where people have to end up, but it's also a very scary prospect simultaneously to figure that out. And so, I think it's about being open-minded. It's about being understanding that we're going to have to potentially try new things, or I should say, bring back old things in some cases. I think this is also why traditional ecological knowledge is beginning to have more of a reverberation, because people understanding the land connection and how First Peoples have had that as part of their being, and that the white legal construct of viewing the world is really the result of the destruction that we're seeing. Do you have another quick point that you want to make before we bring others in?
I'll make it quick in case people don't know that Extinction Rebellion is using civil disobedience as their driver, building on what we've learned from Gandhi and King and all the nonviolent civil disobedience movements. So that's the law breaking that needs to happen, to just like the suffragettes had, that was what they used to get the right to vote. And so I just want, in case people don't know, that that's the way this is going to get accomplished, according to Extinction Rebellion, is through civil disobedience.
Yep, I think there's a lot of merit to that. I saw a question, Nancy, if that Deb had posted about state legislatures and when these, denials of.
Right. Go ahead. I was just wondering if Deb wanted to clarify it, because I'm not real clear on the question. Deb, do you want to just step in here and clarify what your question is?
Yeah, well, I can. I guess I was just, again, in that hopeful place that the system had some kind of a checks and balance for the legislatures going to hell in a handbasket. And, the concept of voting people out is far too long in happening. It's got to be an immediate kind of response to bad behaviors. And what Terry was talking about for the denial of putting rights of nature into any kind of measure, or to challenge wrongful suits against the CAFOs, or for, like we have here, people who are sprayed with toxins don't have any rights to challenge that as wrongful, harmful activity unless they die. So is there any way that there's any kind of a check on that? Does the executive branch have any status to do that? Or can we sue the legislature or sue the wrongful kinds of statutes?
Deb, I think you are taking the legislature to court with your own case. You're challenging the idea that state ceiling preemption should prevail.
Right.
Because you've been living under the legacy of state ceiling preemption when it's come to pesticides for 50 years, which is, if you listen to Jennifer Pomerance, she'll tell you, once these state ceiling preemption laws are put in place, they're very hard to get rid of. So they're not actionable largely because the powers that be don't want you to act on them. And once they know that they're in place, they're hard to undo and get rid of. I mean, there are some cases, of course, where they've undone some state ceiling preemption, but it's few and far between. So in my mind, you guys have found a different way to do the very thing that you're asking, which is you're calling into question the legislature. You're calling into question the preemption of the pesticide issue. And even more significantly, you're calling in state ceiling preemption itself through your case, which could result in actual new legislation coming in on a broader level. And so I think instead of how do you hold them to account, because clearly the people who enacted, the pesticide law in Oregon are not even around as far as even in office. Some of them might not even be alive anymore. It's a tall order to kind of hold individuals, let's say, to account, or even bodies to account, through their own rules. So I think part of it is looking at how do we go about it in different means. And I think you and your group in Wayne County have found successful ways to call some very significant things into account, even though, of course, we know that they're still in motion, they're still real. But I think they've been far more effective than if you would have tried to, find a way for another branch, for instance, to do things. Terry might have a different perspective, but I think you've been hugely successful in answering your own question through your own work.
Well, but then they can say they won't hear our case too.
Well, sure. We know that's going to happen. I mean, you all knew that was going to happen. I mean, the system is not ours. I mean, to put it simply, it's not our system. So part of the illusion is to believe that it is. And so that means we have to create the system that we want, whether it's through parallel systems, whether it's about, getting behind new legislation to change constitutional constructs. But it is eventually going to come down to where we're going to put our energy and what has the greatest probability. And that's where you decide to go. And so it's yet to be seen, but I think that's the reality of what we're up against. It's when I said this is 500 plus years of English common law, it's, colonization has not stopped. Let's put it that way. It's just taken different forms, different actors, different justification, but we're still colonizing the planet and people. And, someone has to get in the way of that. And it's their rules.
Yeah.
And also, I'd just like to, those are wise words. And it's your deeds actually may be producing results that you don't clearly recognize. One example I can give is that one of our Ohio organizer is from a Cleveland suburb, and they successfully passed an initiative that prevented fracking because, yes, it was going on in this upper middle class suburb right by a middle school, and it was amazing. The fracking activity going on scattered through this lovely community. And it, of course, ultimately was struck down by a court. But we found out that I think I would call it the shame factor, has kept the city administration forever after from purchasing and using radioactive fracking brine as a de-icer on city streets, which is a big deal in Ohio. The fact that there are ongoing attempts to commodify the use of what's effectively radioactive waste from oil and gas drilling, being used as a dust suppressant in the summer and a very corrosive de-icer in the winter. So we found out, the organizer found out rather by accident that that in effect, passage of ramming that particular anti-fracking ban into law with a pretty serious 2/3 majority of all people voting, even though it was ultimately struck down, the city administration was not willing to put themselves in the situation of still having any open connection with the fracking industry. You have to understand that the victories may be small and they may even be innocuous or invisible, but you have to understand that you are having some effect. You are changing the debate incrementally. And, I mean, I certainly have times of complete deflation, but you just kind of have to make the choices for the future and for future generations, and realize that they will you can hand the baton off to them. But as Kai has heard innumerable times from me, when we win, it's a stay of execution. When they win, it's forever. And, you know, I'm going to continue to hold out for that stay of execution.
Hmm.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks, Kai.
Yeah,
Yes, and thanks so much to both of you. Before we have maybe time for one more question, if anybody has something they would like to add or comment, then I will ask both Kai and Terry to give us some final thoughts. Leave us on a positive note here.
yeah, I like what Terry said. I like what Michelle just dropped into chat. You know, about job security as justice seekers. Yeah, I mean, it's constantly shifting ground. There's constantly things throwing in our way. It's all deliberate. We have to see that. We have to be smarter. And I think, you know, to your point earlier, Nancy, we have to find ways to come together as people, and realize that we're all basically in the same boat here. And the system has done a very good job of keeping us separate and divided and believing that we don't all want the same things. And I think there's some hope there that I've been seeing, or possibility I've been seeing in that realm, which I think is good. And so, yeah, one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, I second that. I think that we're just going to have to hope that it's not going to, that our efforts have some effect in the world, and that you're instructing people, even people that you don't know, are paying attention.
Well said. Thank you both. Thank you so much. Really
Thank you all.
very interesting.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.